Hello everyone, how are you? And welcome to this little analysis we're going to be doing here on your midterm exam. I've been meaning to do this for a while. I try to do it every semester I teach this class. I think it's useful for you guys to get a sense of how the results of the exam look from the perspective of the professor, and also to get a sense of a sort of significance of the exam and your results from your own point of view. Students in the past have reported that this was very helpful in terms of helping them understand their own performance relative to the performance of the class. It can really make the difference when you start to understand, if you did really well or if you did really badly, what that means in terms of where the rest of the class is. So I feel this is a sort of a way that we can all be honest with each other together and make some progress here. So let's have a look and see what the exam results contain. Now, this won't be a very long video, but I'm going to focus on a couple of questions here, which are hard. I'll look at a number of questions actually, but there's a couple of questions in here that are, if you just look with me on the next slide here, there's a couple of questions that are going to show up as being difficult, and we'll want to really sort of drill down and try to think together about why those questions were difficult. Is it my fault? Were they poorly phrased questions? Were they questions that we didn't go over sufficiently in class? Were they questions that were not sufficiently addressed in the readings? These are the sorts of things we're going to be trying to think about in the next few minutes here together. But before we get into the questions, let's just take a moment to go over the actual results of the exam here from the macro perspective. So you can see there were 100 possible points and 50 questions. So that was going to be 2 points per question. That's something to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, we had a couple of people who got kicked out of the test halfway through, and that's something I'm working on with those students. I hope to have those situations resolved for them as we move through the semester. Them being kicked out of the exam was not their fault. They encountered technical difficulties, which we have found hard to resolve within the time frame of the test. Now, so why do I mention that? I mention that because it could be that those two students, their situation is distorting the results of the test. They would compromise about 6% of the class, and it's not an insignificant number when you think about it in that sense. So their score is pulling down the average score somewhat here. Now, I should say it's a great compliment, I think, to yourselves that the average score is as high as it is. It's not a very high average score, admittedly. It's not the average score that I want to see, but it is an average score that is higher, about 4.5 points higher than the same class taking the similar enough exam, some modifications, some differences, but a similar enough exam this time last year. So as a class, you're doing better this year than the class last year by 4.5 points. And that's notwithstanding the fact that 2 students got kicked out of the exam for technological reasons, and that actually, they could be distorting the average score somewhat there, by virtue of the fact that their score is effectively 0. Now, another thing I'm seeing here, however, while you guys did better than the students last year, you took less time to do the exam. So you can see here that we have, a 35-minute average time to take the test. That's a bit low for my liking. I would like to have seen a much longer time taken to complete the exam. 35 minutes is too quick. When you think about it being 50 questions, that means that you were taking, the questions, way too quickly. I would like at least to sort of see something much more like a 50-minute test. Last year, the students were taking more like 40 plus, something closer to 45 minutes to complete the exam. That would have been much more preferable to me. And as you can see here, and as I mentioned in the intro, there's 2 hard questions listed on the difficulty. But another thing that we want to take in mind as we go through the next few slides here is this question of discrimination. Now, what does discrimination mean? Obviously, it can mean something like racism or something, right? So that's not exactly what's being assessed when we think about it from a statistical point of view. The discrimination in question here is discrimination in connection with whether or not we could imagine the students who did well on the rest of the test, or in the test generally, were able to make a fair stab of a particular question. Now, sometimes a question is going to produce a kind of a bipolarity. A lot of students get it right and a lot of students get it wrong in one particular kind of going for what you might call a false friend. That is to say, going for a question that looks like it might be right. And so you see sort of like two groups. That wouldn't be such a discriminatory question. That might be a hard question, but it wouldn't be a discriminatory question. A discriminatory question, as we're going to see in a minute, in a few slides' time, that is, a discriminatory question is going to be a question that really the results were all over the map. You have some of the bad students doing well in it, some of the good students doing badly on it, but no overall consistency. We have 4 options for each test, for each question rather, and we're not going to see any kind of clumping. It's not going to be a bipolarity. It's going to be just all over the map. So we do actually have a question like that, maybe even 2, in the results. And so if we're going to be starting to think about a curve, generally those are the ones I'm going to be focusing on. The very, very poor questions in the sense of discrimination are the ones I'm going to be really focusing in on to see if there's any argument to be made for giving you guys a couple of extra points. Now, before we proceed to discuss what the curve should be, I will analyze the various questions in under analysis here that I'm talking about. But before we proceed to sort of even specify what a curve might be, the key point to sort of mention is that I think that a good exam is an exam where the average score is somewhere in the B- to B territory. So that's going to be from 80 to 85%. So as you can see, we're quite short of that for this test. We're at about the 75% mark, which is a C. It's a flat C. And that's not great. Before we even begin to think about a curve, I think it'll be very important for students to reflect on what they could have done better to prepare themselves for this test. There was a very good study guide, issued for you. The questions, I think, on the whole, as you can see, were largely good questions. There's 34 good questions, 8 fair questions, 7 poor questions. But again, those could be poor for a variety of different reasons. It could be my fault. It could be your fault in terms of the way you're reading it or the way you're preparing. So the paucity, if you will, of the question isn't exactly necessarily a given. We need to sort of focus on the questions and the specifics of those questions to understand why that's so. So again, I am looking for discriminatory questions. Now, difficult questions are questions that it's a little more easy to understand what difficulty is as opposed to discrimination. Difficulty is simply, how did people do on the whole? Did a high average of students get a specific question right? Or did a low average of students get a specific question right? And so those are the issues we want to be looking at in terms of difficulty. I suppose without any further ado, it's time to start looking at the actual questions themselves. So let's start, first of all, with what an easy question looked like and try to understand how easy questions appear from the perspective of the exam giver, i.e. in this instance, myself. So here's an easy question. Now you can see a lot of things sort of going on here. This is the Clash of Civilizations thesis question that everyone got right, even people who performed poorly in the rest of the test, the so-called bottom 25, the bottom 50%, the bottom 75%, all did very, very well in this test. And so that's good news. That's something that we like to see, that there are questions in the exam that everyone found relatively easy. And as we know from the previous slide, there were a lot of questions that people found relatively easy. I'm happy enough with that, okay? So now that we know what an easy question looks like, let's have a look at one of the harder questions in the exam, where you can see that we had a difficulty factor here that we need to think about, right? So this is the question about what we term, what we label the overarching central authority, the arena with no overarching central authority above the individual collection of sovereign states within which international politics takes place. Now, the majority of students, for some strange reason here, you can see 19 out of 29 of you picked the United Nations. Now, I don't even think that it would be a question here at all as to whether we talked about what anarchy means in the class. We talked about it a lot, so I don't even think that that's a question. We talked about it a lot, especially in the first day that we were together. We talked about it as well in the context of our conversation about obedience and Hobbes, the philosopher Hobbes. So, given that it's been a topic a number of times with us, I'm a little surprised to see so very many people get this question incorrect. Now, 19 people got this question wrong, okay? Yet, I think even if we hadn't discussed it in class, I think even if it hadn't been described in the literature, there might be an argument to be made that at least half of you should have been able to get this question correct just by guessing. Now, why might that be? Well, if you look and read carefully, if you look at the question and read it carefully, you can see that it says the arena with no overarching central authority. So by kind of elimination, we can start to logically figure out what the correct answer might be here. Now, we have, for example, looked at the question of the Leviathan before. The Leviathan was the name of Thomas Hobbes's book, and that is the giant figure that was coming over the hillside, looming over the town. One person in the class did pick the Leviathan as the answer, and I'm a little bit astounded at that, to be honest, because, of course, a Leviathan implies or gives us a sort of an idea of a giant figure, right? A significant, monstrous entity, you might say, looming over us. And even if you hadn't heard of Thomas Hobbes's book before, the idea of a Leviathan, I think, certainly doesn't seem very much like it might be an arena, right? An arena is kind of like where you see a boxing or a wrestling match taking place or something like this. So hegemony, well, that could be, an interesting one to think about there, all right? It's a tricky word. It's a fancy word, a word we don't come across very much. So if you're not plugged into what hegemony means, and we've talked about it a number of times in the class, by the way, we've given it a definition and everything in our lectures, so maybe no excuse there. But let's just say you weren't in class that day. Hegemony might be the one that you would sort of keep an open mind on. So let's not eliminate hegemony just yet. The United Nations is another option. It's option number one. Now, is the United Nations an arena? I suppose in some ways you could say it's a forum, it's a venue, it's a kind of a talking shop or a parliament. But what would it mean to say the arena with no overarching central authority above the individual collection of sovereign states? I mean, if you think about the question, what we're talking about here is the absence of a central authority. Now, the United Nations doesn't have a central authority for sure. It's not an entity, an actor that could be characterized as the central authority, for example, of international relations. It is more like a talking shop. But the implication of the question is that the United Nations, or at least the correct answer that we're looking for here, is something that cannot wield power over the nation states. What we're looking for is something that's purely an arena within which action takes place, not an arena that itself has any authority. And of course, historically, we know that the United Nations has many times had authority. When the Security Council, the top 5 nations of the planet, come together and make a decision, that decision is binding, for example, in the Security Council. So, the Korean War. We haven't talked about it in class, but anyone with a basic knowledge of history would know that the Korean War was fought on behalf of the United Nations, or in the name of the United Nations. Similarly, we've had United Nations Security Council resolutions to go into Iraq and to go into other countries. So it's not clear then you could say that the United Nations has no, literally zero, overarching central authority. It isn't an elected government with a sovereign power of its own, for sure, but it does have a modicum of authority. And I wanted to mention that because what we're doing here is elimination, and we're looking for the most correct answer, as I mentioned in class. The most correct answer is the answer that is the correct answer. It's not usually the case that there's only one answer that seems right. So sometimes we're looking for questions that might appear to have, more than one correct answer. So the United Nations, we have to kind of keep an open mind on it, because the next option we have to look at here is anarchy. And anarchy is, it's clearly a term that we've used in class a number of times to describe the field or terrain whereupon international relations takes place. And what I would say to you in relation to this term is that anarchy is a concept that has bearing for us simply by virtue of the fact, in contrast to, for example, the concept of the United Nations, we cannot say that anarchy has ever had a power to sort of exist over and above us as some kind of authority, right? So by process of elimination here, even if you hadn't studied fully and even if you hadn't been fully paying attention in class, it's beginning to become clear that at least of the three that we've sort of evaluated, anarchy is more likely the probable answer. Now, earlier on, we had put hegemony on the shelf because hegemony might be an unusual word for us. Taking hegemony back off the shelf now and comparing it to the question of anarchy, I think it's very clear that anarchy is the more probably correct answer, because again, we gave a very sound argument, a very logical argument just a moment ago, where we said that anarchy is the term that we've looked at so far that's very hard to describe as having any authority at all. So, what might it mean to say anarchy has authority? It's sort of an illogical statement. So, a Leviathan can have authority. It turns out if we know the definition of hegemony, we can certainly say hegemony has authority, right? And the United Nations has historically had authority, right? It is an institution that has historically had that, and has, on the basis of that, been able to, commit nations to go to war and punish nations, in fact, as it's done since its inception. So, it's a bit of a head scratcher for me. I would not have genuinely, and I believe if I even went back and I looked at the results of previous previous classes that have taken an exam with this question, I don't think that I would have seen so many people get this wrong. It's a puzzling one for me. It makes me scratch my head. It makes me wonder, what was going on here such that we would have struggled with this question the way we have. Certainly, it's very puzzling and troubling to see 9 of the top 25 students in the class getting this one wrong. Okay, so with that all said, it's time to move on. That was a hard question. And we know it's a hard question because even the top 25% of the class got it wrong in a clump. There's a real strange thing going on here when over half of the best students are getting it so wrong. 75% even of the best students getting it wrong. So moving on, here's another question now, and a similar phenomena going on here where we can see a lot of the best students in the class are getting this question incorrect. So this is about the instrumentalist reading of nature. Now, admittedly, it might be argued, it might be said that this is a kind of an esoteric question because it involves a technical word, the word instrumentalism. But on the other hand, this is a word that was flagged for you in the study guide. It's a word that we did drill down on in our lecture when we talked about how different groups of people in the course of history have sort of seen nature as just a resource simply waiting there for us to use. So let us have a look at the breakdown of possible answers here. We have Marxists, Christians, capitalists, and all of the above. Now, why would all of the above be on there? Certainly that's already something that's worth looking at. When we see all of the above, we have to take the option seriously, right? It's not just a throwaway option. Sometimes it's a sort of mess with your head kind of answer. So certainly the person who wrote the test, i.e. me, could be messing with you a little bit there. It's possible. But we can begin to sort of throw a bit of logic at this and start to see what the various possible answers could be here. So Marxists, okay, well, Marxists have, if we were in class that day, or if you read the Simon Dolby chapter, you would know that Marxists have sometimes had a tendency to look at nature as something that's there to serve the interests of the proletariat, right? We just even recently talked about Marxism, and we know that the Marxist conception of history puts the proletariat at the center, and so, human beings certainly have a prerogative to use nature, to use the raw materials of nature to advance their interests as a species, right? That's something that Marxists would certainly seem to be claiming. Even if you didn't know much about Marxism, you could kind of imagine that is something a Marxist might hold true. Now, if you know anything about Christianity, the same can be said there again. God said in the Bible, go forth, increase, and multiply, And when Moses got to the promised land, he told the Hebrews, this is a land that I'm giving to you, So you must use it and make your lives better through the use of it. So now capitalists, of course, I think we already all know, do have exactly this instrumentalist view of the land, because they see the land literally as raw materials for production. And Marxists, I think, and Christians, as we've elaborated a moment ago, have a pretty similar view. I mean, they may not be embracing the profit motive and exploiting the land for profit, but there's other reasons they might want to exploit the land. And so actually, if we look at history, we find that both Marxists, Christians, and capitalists have all carried out environmental disasters, have all been responsible for environmental disasters. So that's certainly something to think about. It's very possible then, even if you hadn't properly studied for this test, that it could literally be all of the above. There's a very good, solid reason for thinking that all of the above is in fact the answer. And so, could we hand on heart then say that the only correct answer here is capitalism? In my opinion, I don't think we could. And again, I'm saying that hypothetically, if I'm the person who hadn't even studied very well for the test, I think a logical answer there, but would be all of the above. But nevertheless, we see that half of the best students, almost half at least, of the very best students are picking capitalism as the answer. Which is an interesting one. So perhaps we didn't go over it enough in lecture. Perhaps it wasn't emphasized enough in the readings, although I would contend that it was. But it's just something we need to think about as we move forward. Now, one last slide for you here. This is just to show you what a discriminatory question looks like. We had only... So discriminatory questions are interesting because they can also be very easy, where it's kind of not clear that the question was difficult at all. Like a real throwaway question is also, in its own sense, a discriminatory question, because even the bad students are doing well at it, We had one of those earlier on, for example. Keeping that in mind, I have a way within Blackboard of getting Blackboard to show me the questions that are both discriminatory and hard. And this is the question that was both discriminatory and hard. There was just one, and here it was. Now, it's interesting to me because, we did at some length in the class, and the Peter Mandeville chapter does quite clearly state this, that there is a difference between Al-Qaeda which is Osama bin Laden's organization. Well, he's dead now, of course, but it was his organization. It was the organization that carried out the attacks on the World Trade Center in 9/11. So Al-Qaeda is a global jihadist organization, very, very different in some ways to the Arab nationalist organizations that get discussed, for example, in the documentary The Power of Nightmares. Excuse me. With that in mind, we have already in class at length discussed Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism, for example, that showed up in the regimes of Ataturk and also in the early Egyptian, the days of early Egyptian independence. So we know that, for example, therefore, Hezbollah, Hamas are older organizations than Al-Qaeda. If we know anything about these organizations at all, we know that Hezbollah is an Iran and Syria sponsored entity that has prevailed in southern Lebanon. And if we know anything about Hamas, we know it's a Palestinian organization that prevails largely in the Palestinian territories in their struggle against Israeli colonization and occupation. Now, are any of those entities ever known for having sort of particularly carried out global jihad, right? Arguably not. They are Islamic organizations. One is Shia, the other is Sunni. We know that those two religions don't always connect as well as they might. There's some enmity between some parties of each faith or sub-faith, branch of faith, whichever way you prefer to describe it. But that all said, the interesting factoid here is not so much that these two groups come from Shia and Sunni faiths, but that they are localistic in their ambitions. Right, so Hezbollah is trying to preserve southern Lebanon from Israeli aggression. Hamas is trying to preserve the Palestinian territories from Israeli aggression. Neither have ever particularly been on board with Osama bin Laden's global jihadist ideology. So let's have a look at why this is a discriminatory question. It's a discriminatory question because there's no particular pattern in the breakdown. If you want to look at how the top 25% of students did for this question, you can see quite clearly that they did very, very differently. There's 2 of our best students getting answer 1, 4 of our best students getting none of the above, 3 of our best students getting option 3, which is stating that because while Muslim, Hezbollah and Hamas are primarily secular national liberationist organizations. I mean, just think about that for a second, guys. Think about that one for a second, right? Number 3 is logically incoherent, right? You don't even need to sort of like be an expert on this to figure that one out. Look at it again. Because while Muslim, Hezbollah and Hamas are primarily secular national liberationist organizations. Well, how can they be secular and Muslim, right? So it's a trick. That's a trick answer right there. And 3 of our best students picked that answer, which is a bit of a surprise for me. And then option 1, which is also incorrect, was because Osama bin Laden rejects nationalist Islamist ideology of Hezbollah and Hamas. Well, let's think about that for a second, right? It could be that there's an argument for that answer. But does Osama bin Laden reject the national Islamist ideology of Hezbollah and Hamas? I think he probably rejects the idea, when he was alive at least, he rejected the idea of national struggle. As in the sense that he rejected clearly and sort of demonstrated already the Power of Nightmares that people, his antecedents, his intellectual influences were people who really believed in sort of restoring what was known as the Ummah, which we discussed in class. This pan-Islamic entity that once upon a time existed in the guise of the Caliphate. One is an option, but it seems that the bigger issue is not so much Osama bin Laden's tendency one way or the other. It wasn't sort of the key answer here is the reason why we would not want to confuse the armed struggles of Hezbollah and Hamas with that of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda is not so much what Al-Qaeda thinks about them, but because of what they think about Al-Qaeda. And specifically, those groups do reject the idea of global jihadist ideology. That is a stated and emphasized goal on their part, as the Mandeville chapter makes it very clear. And we did actually discuss this in class one of the days that we were present. So any old how, it's my sort of duty to look at these results and to figure out what an actual curve might be. I usually prefer to have a kind of a good, solid reason for giving a curve. Obviously, this question that we're looking at right now was a discriminatory question, and so I because it was a difficult question and a discriminatory question, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day to me whether it was stated in class or not. Clearly, clearly the point did not get through, and clearly the question was too hard. So for that reason, I'm willing to give an extra 2 points for this question. Going back up the chain here to look at our other questions, the hard questions, I think clearly something was wrong in the mix somewhere, although I can't quite understand it. These were also very, very difficult questions. And so these are the two hard questions then, and the question that was also hard but also discriminatory. And on the basis of the muddled results coming through from each of these, I think it's probably fair and reasonable for me to give a 5 or 6 point curve on the exam. I'll have to see how both of those numbers affect the outcome. Does it put a lot of people, for example, who may be getting A's up into sort of like A+++ territory? If it's doing that, then I probably won't give 6, I'll give 5. But certainly, I think a good compromise here, again, because the questions were high quality questions, and the fault seems to me, in my mind anyway, to be less to do with whether these things were or weren't addressed in class, whether these things were or weren't addressed in the readings, or even whether these things were or weren't addressed in the study guide. They were. So it's a struggle for me to figure out what the excuse is here. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily want to give 6 whole points. So that's my hesitation there, and also the fact that it may put too many people who have A's up into a higher category, a non-existent category, where they're getting like 101, 102%, which obviously would be illogical. So with that in mind, then I think it's going to be a 5 point curve, possibly a 6. We can decide it another day towards the end of the semester. And that concludes, anyway, and I hope this was helpful, that concludes our analysis of the exam. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Good night.